During the reign of the Emperor Valens, the Goths were defeated and pursued by the Huns. The Goths were with their wives and their children. They were at risk of all dying slow and terrible deaths. Edward Gibbon writes, in The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, he, Valens, was informed that the north was agitated by a furious tempest, that the eruption of the Huns, an unknown and monstrous race of savages, had subverted the power of the Goths, and that the suppliant multitudes of that warlike nation, whose pride was now humbled in the dust, covered a space of many miles along the banks of the river. With outstretched arms and pathetic lamentations they loudly deplored their past misfortunes and their present danger, acknowledged that their only hope for safety was in the clemency of the Roman government, and most solemnly protested that, if the gracious liberality of the emperor would permit them to cultivate the waste lands of Thrace, they should ever hold themselves bound, by the strongest obligations of duty and gratitude, to obey the laws and to guard the limits of the republic. Then the emperor, after deliberation, decided to allow the Goths into the Roman Empire. Back to the book, which states, the prayers of the Goths were granted, and their service was accepted by the imperial court, and orders were immediately dispatched to the civil and military governors of the Thracian diocese to make the necessary preparations for the passage and subsistence of a great people, till a proper and sufficient territory would be allotted for their future residence. So just to recap where we are at so far, the Goths lost a war and were pushed out of their original home, were experiencing economic hardship. They were what we would now call asylum seekers. The Romans, who had no place for them to go, tried to set up temporary shelters and provided them with food and the other necessities of life. Sound familiar? Now the Romans did try and set up some conditions for the Goths. Back to the book. During the suspense of a doubtful negotiation, the impatient Goths made some rash attempts to pass the Danube without the permission of the government whose protection they had implored. Their motions were strictly observed by the vigilance of the troops which were stationed along the river, and their foremost detachment was defeated with considerable slaughter. Yet such were the timid counsels of the reign of Valens, that such brave officers who had served their country in the execution of their duty were punished by the loss of their employment, and narrowly escaped the loss of their heads. Have you watched the news lately? Sounds familiar again, does it not? As the Roman authorities were moving the Goths, there was a count done. In the multitude of people there were 200,000 men of military fighting age, and about 1 million Goths in total who would now be a part of the Roman Empire. Now this was a crisis the Romans brought onto themselves, but they were not innocent in how they treated the Goths after the Goths arrived. Corruption and greed had so infested every of governance. The two people put in charge to ensure the Goths were provided for were men named Lipicinus and Maximus. Instead of obeying the orders of their sovereign, and satisfying, with decent liberality, the demands of the Goths, they levied an ungenerous and oppressive tax on the wants of the hungry barbarians. The vilest food was sold at an extravagant price, and, in the room of wholesome and substantial provisions, the markets were filled with the flesh of dogs and of unclean animals who had died of disease. They, the Goths, beheld around them the wealth and plenty of a fertile province, in the midst of which they suffered the intolerable hardship of artificial famine. At this same time the Roman generals took down the defenses on the Danube River. Now there is just no way any government is going to be able to long-term look after and provide for the needs of 1 million people and do it properly. It is an impossible task. With large centralized governments there will always be corruption and mismanagement when dealing with projects, especially one on such a large scale as to take care of 1 million people. It is built into the system. Even if the government were to do a good job, human nature dictates the people who receive the benefits be envious of the people who have more than them and demand more. And when you demand more you put yourself in the place of a victim, or the oppressed. And therefore, fighting back is then morally justified. Two subsets of the Goths were the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths. These two groups formed a secret alliance, and they marched to a city called Adrianople. Back to the book, which shows how it takes one small spark to burn everything down. Roman Lipicinus had invited the Gothic chiefs to a splendid entertainment, and their marital train remained under arms at the entrance of the palace. But the gates of the city were strictly guarded, and the barbarians were sternly excluded from the use of a plentiful market, to which they asserted their equal claim of subjects and allies. Their humble prayers were rejected with insolence and derision, and as their patience was now exhausted, the townspeople, the soldiers, and the Goths were soon in a conflict of passionate altercation and angry reproaches. A blow was imprudently given, a sword was hastily drawn, and the first blood that was spilt in this accidental quarrel became a signal of a long and destructive war. This then started a war which ended in the Battle of Adrianople, in which 2/3 of the Roman army was destroyed along with the Emperor Valens himself. The imprudence of Valens and his ministers had introduced into the heart of the empire a nation of enemies. Many consider this moment as the turning point which truly became the fall of the Roman Empire. And it all started with the Huns defeating the Goths. Not even with the Romans being involved at all, a problem came to their doorstep in which they weren't capable of handling. It turned the people they were trying to help against them, and it brought down the whole empire. Sounds like history may repeat itself again in the next coming years. I really hope not, but we need to read history and truly understand these examples with humility. We aren't better than the Roman government who made these decisions, we aren't smarter or more moral. We aren't any better at running a functioning government. Throughout the book, Gibbon refers to the Goths as freedom-loving people. Did the Romans take that into consideration? Maybe, maybe not, we will never know. The American system is in many ways modeled after the Romans. Will we also fall the same way? Only time will tell, but in reading what came next for the Romans, we need to tread carefully.